You've done an extraordinary job for the community, and I'm deeply impressed. So much so I began to rewrite this afternoon what I thought I ought to be saying to you. And I decided that the real subject is risk and trust. I'd start with the long ago journey that Temple and I took together, knowing that there are no answers. There are only choices. But choices can be changed, and you will change them, and you will be changed by them. We choose in the dark, but I look to the words of neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran, who writes, let me get the paper out and I'll tell you exactly what he writes. Autism reminds us that the uniquely human sense of self is not an airy nothing without habitation and a name. The self actually emerges from a reciprocity of interacts with others. Others, of course, are us. What we're doing right now. We can help our children to change. It may not be perfect. It may not even be complete, but it will be there. And in the process, we too will change. With change comes hope. I've always felt that real hope is a kind of bet. You check out the odds and you place your bet. You choose who you will trust and who you will allow to help you with your child. Temple was born in 1947. She will turn 67 this summer. If you're checking on me, I'm 87. You have to remember at that time that no babies were born in World War II. The men were all fighting. Temple was the first baby I ever held, and I had no way to know what to expect. Important, I think, perhaps for doctors to be told tonight, I had a severe case of flu in the first trimester. You might put that into your research, your thinking. I think it's probably worth remembering. By the time Temple was 2, I knew that something was very wrong. She was mute. She wouldn't look at me. She couldn't play peekaboo. She didn't grab for my scarf and try to stick it in her mouth. Instead, she would spit and go into gales of crazy laughter. She'd pull her feces out of her diaper and play with it and smear it on the wallpaper. Her feces and her spit were better companions than I was. Most of all, and hardest for me, she didn't want to be touched. I took her to Children's Hospital in Boston to the Judge Baker Guidance Clinic. I've always liked the name of that clinic, Guidance. It must have been endowed by Judge Baker, who believed that troubled children deserved early guidance so they wouldn't end up in court facing him. The court term in those days was stubborn child, a cruelly dismissive title that dated back into the 19th century. That clinic still exists in Boston Hospital today, Children's Hospital in Boston. It is still called the Judge Baker Guidance Clinic. The head of the clinic, Dr. Bronson Crothers, examined Temple. Well, he said she certainly is a very odd little girl. And then he asked me if I was willing to let her come to the hospital for a 10-day visit, alone, without me. I would be allowed to watch her through a one-way mirror. It was my first big act of trust, and it was difficult. Could Temple manage alone, without me? What would happen? Could I depend on Dr. Carruthers? Could I trust the hospital staff to be loving to my child? I decided I would have to. I said yes. It turned out that Temple didn't miss me. I was the one who missed her. Temple loved her little red bed there in the hospital, but she wouldn't play with the other children in the nursery. Instead, she pushed paper scraps around the floor. And I remember how Dr. Carruthers pushed a scrap underneath the door, and Temple pushed it back. I watched through the one-way mirror as they pushed the paper back and forth. It was a kind of communication, a kind of response. And I thought of the fact that Temple had responded when I played the Bach on the piano. She had hummed back its little melody. I knew she was there. I knew she could grow. The diagnosis at that time was autism, infant schizophrenia, and that was a hard one to swallow. But Dr. Carruthers said, well, I think she's going to learn to talk, but let's speed up the process. And he told me to go to a Mrs. Reynolds, who had a little schoolroom in her house in Belmont, Massachusetts, where she taught children to speak. Temple went to Mrs. Reynolds for 3 years. She was almost 5 when she finally learned to speak, and as we all know, she hasn't stopped talking ever since. Mrs. Reynolds also taught Temple something probably just as important as speech, maybe even more so, that there were other children in this school, and Temple had to learn to be aware of them and to wait her turn. It was her first connection not only to other children, but to the needs of other children. That summer, Temple went to Mrs. Huckle's camp, and then in September, she was mainstreamed into the Dedham Country Day School. We lived in Dedham, Massachusetts, where the headmaster said, yes, we'll take Temple, but only if we can work together with you. We can't do this alone. Mrs. Deach and I talked to each other almost every day. And Temple learned that whatever happened in school, her mother knew it. And whatever happened at home, Mrs. Deach knew it. It held Temple to a consistent behavior pattern that she was expected to live up to. That's consistency and expectation. Both are important for all children, not just those on the spectrum. I'd like to thank the teachers who are here tonight. Teaching is not a science. It's an intuitive understanding, and it cannot be systemized. It is a one-on-one practice. Each child is different. Now we come to adolescence, and that's really difficult, the most difficult of all, for all children. Mother Nature says to all children, throw away the rule book. I'm going to give you a new body, new clothes, new friends, new customs, and strange new feelings. Trust and risk are great. Temple was kicked out of the junior high school she was attending at that time. She'd outgrown the little Dedham Country Day School. It was a cruel, dismissive action, sort of in the category of stubborn child. Every time I think of it, I get angry all over again. Fortunately, and it was a lucky piece of fortune, I was researching for GBS, which is the PBS station in Boston, a television documentary on children on the autism spectrum. And I had visited every special school in New England. New England is good on education. And I visited them as a journalist. I didn't always tell them that I had a daughter on the spectrum, because I knew they would talk to me differently if I did. So what I did was I picked out 3 of those schools that I thought were really tops. And I said to Temple, we'll go visit those schools, and you can pick out the one you would like to go to. I wanted to accomplish 2 things. I wanted her to see what other schools were doing, and I wanted her to have a voice in her own destiny. We visited the 3 schools, and she picked out Hampshire Country School, which was a high school in New Hampshire for teenagers with autism. Henry Patey, the headmaster of the school, was wise and wonderful. The school had horses and cows and farm life, and Temple, that's where you first began to connect with farm animals, and it led you into your career. And it took Temple 6 years to do 5 years of high school. Teenagers on the autism spectrum need extra time. There's no particular reason to hold them to a precise time schedule. When Temple did graduate from Hampshire Country School, she wanted to go to college, but she couldn't yet manage exams, college entrance exams. Now here's where contact and friends matter enormously. Henry Patey was close friends with Frank DiPietro, who was president of Franklin Pierce College. Between them, they decided to take the risk and accept Temple into Franklin Pierce without any entrance exams. Theirs was a partnership of risk and trust, and it paid off. Temple graduated second in a class of 400. I look back with gratitude. I look back in gratitude at the doctors, the therapists, the teachers who guided and supported Temple and who guided and supported me. It was always one-on-one, shared expertise and shared concern. The internet system cannot do that. A computer cannot deal with if. What if this or that should happen? The computer can tell you the odds, but the odds are based on what has already happened. A computer cannot deal with if, the future, the possibilities. A computer cannot cope with who we are, what we want to be, or why we trust each other. Today, we're in a culture that our computer has led us into that is complicated and shallow and curiously passive. We've allowed the internet to turn us into baby birds with open beaks, waiting for Google to pop an answer into our lives, too comfortable to forage for our own insights. This is what also faces young parents today who aren't sure how to move, and it particularly seems to affect the young fathers. I'm more conscious of young men today than I've ever been before because I have 5 grandsons who are all in their 20s, and I see how unformed they still are, though they're big, all of them, but they are still naive in the ways of the world and in the ways of their own heart. In autism, the ratio of male to female is 4-to-1 male. In Asperger, the ratio is 10-to-1 male. Spectrum boys are being raised by single mothers. Who is going to teach these boys how to be men? So, gentlemen, you who are here, we need your help desperately. We cannot do this, we can't do any of this without you. In fact, we can't even teach our sons the male etiquette for a public urinal. You're going to have to do this. We cannot dismiss these boys to the old title of stubborn child. This brings up the question of pain. It's an interesting question. Physical pain, we have trouble recalling the actual sensation. We only remember that we hurt. That's not true of psychic pain. Psychic pain never leaves us. It's with us in an instant, a grief ghost. Men take autism harder than women do. Somehow it strikes at the heart of their sense of honor. We women are not in the business of honor. We're built to incubate life and make it grow. Our bodies swell with birth and then return to their old shape. Our breasts fill with milk and then empty. We accept. We're flexible. Men's bodies are muscular and hard to the touch. They're built to hold fast to their honorable intent. But what exactly is that intent? Author James Salter writes of Army Air Corps flight missions in the Korean War, that war between World War II and Vietnam. A time and place, Salter tells us, where free of the gravitational forces of reality, men feel the irresistible lure of the heroic. Among the posted Air Corps maps and charts, Salter gives the highest rating to the claims board. On it was listed the name of every pilot in the group who'd ever had a confirmed claim in Korea. Small red stars marked them. Some of them belonged to dead men. As I read Salter's words, I recalled a man's haunting tale of flying over the Pacific on a World War II bombing mission. How, as he talked, he cherished and relived each detail. The plane's ascent, the perfection of the dawn. Most of all, his own pristine joy. I wish I'd died then, the man said. I remember my shock at his words. It was 15 years since World War II. Had the man found no rewarding, meaningful moment in the post-war years we'd all of us spent raising our children and living out our family lives? Perhaps the kind of honor Salter describes is impossible for a peacetime dad living out the unprepossessing days of job and home, particularly the dad of a child on the autism spectrum. Not just any boy, his boy. For that dad, there might be only the embarrassing intrusion of a kid who doesn't get it. At best, maybe the uncomforting recognition of his child's struggle to master what he thinks it is his dad wants from him. Even if that dad walks away, as many do, yelling that he wants his life back, in his heart, he knows he'll never be free to reach for Salter's glory. Instead, each time he visits his son, shame will creep over him, and with it, an additional shame that he should feel that way. Odd, since autism is primarily a male disorder. Temple's father could never accept Temple. He kept thinking there would be an answer, perfect, immutable. He would always say, if somebody will just tell me what to do, I'll do it. He wanted to be a good man. The course he took was to try to prove that I was insane. It was Temple's doctor who called me in one day. He was Austrian, with one of those sharp Austrian accents. And he said, "Are you aware that Mr. Grandin is trying to prove you are insane, that he has been keeping a notebook on you to prove this?" This doctor faced Temple's father and said, "If you go to court," and his words to me were, "I do not like to do this, but I will do it for you." He faced Temple's father and told him that he was going to testify against him. It didn't make sense what Temple's father was doing, that he wanted to put her in an institution for the retarded. At the same time, when she was there at Hampshire School, he was sending her the Wall Street Journal. It's that change, that odd discrepancy between physical pain and psychic pain. So this is my elegy for Temple's father. In World War II, he survived the Battle of the Bulge in a tank against the Nazis, those enemies of Temple's Viennese doctor. He undertook reconnaissance, searching out the enemy and the chances of survival, acquitting himself with courage and holding fast to his sense of honor. After the war, all he wanted was to return to the life that he'd always known. And what a beautiful life it was, stretching back over the generations. His family's huge old apartment in Boston, with the crackle of starched aprons as the maids circled the dining table. A summer house on the vineyard, with every room looking out on the dazzling blue Sound. The Sound lulling him to sleep with the soft slurp of its inland tide. The tip of each ripple, bright with moonlight. And parties on porches with flowery women and men in red linen trousers. My father-in-law tucking a bachelor's button into his buttonhole and sallying forth to joke with old friends. Tennis in the day and dance music on Saturday night. That's what Temple's father dreamed of in the heat of battle. He didn't think of his life as privileged. He thought of it as home. And now, home had gone horrifyingly awry. Autism was an appalling enemy. If I couldn't see that, then I too must be the enemy. His obsession grew monstrous. He went to battle to destroy us for our own good. And in the end, it led him to dedicating his life to proving that God doesn't exist. Yet through it all, he never lost his faith in the stock market. At night, he would lull himself to sleep, adding up figures from the financial page, writing them down on the flyleaf of whatever book was handy. To this day, I still open books and find those deeply incised columns of calculation, reliable, enduring, whereas God, like the young dogwood, might not make it through the winter. Before he died, Temple's father left word that his body was to be given to a medical school, not so much for the edification of medics, but to prevent a family burial. His children did bury him. Burial services are for the living. They laid his ashes to rest in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's taken me all these years to understand that the tension, the temper, his inability to understand the source of what he so despised in his daughter, it was all his own. And who was there to help him through his childhood, long before anyone had coined the word autism? My rage is gone. Sorrow hits. I ache to forgive him. Over and over I dream that I forgive him and that he forgives me. In the end, I was the one who left, taking with me 4 children and happiness. Where was I in all this? Temple, my darling, when you were born, I was very young. The world I came from, the world I married into, didn't ask for much from me, but social grace. The messy business of talent and passion wasn't encouraged, and passion gone awry, it was hard to excuse. I had to risk rejection, and I was rejected. I had to search for myself, dig under the skin and touch the glossy viscera, looking for what constitutes being human. Autism was a way to learn, but not enough. Acting and writing took me deeper. Singing was my ticket to what I needed to see and touch and feel and be a part of. In the locked wards of the veterans' hospitals, I sang for the men who'd lost their minds in the Korean War. Men who, under the stress of horror, had become catatonic, who stood all day, rigid, wordless. I sang to them. If I knew you were coming, I'd have baked a cake. And here and there, I could see a foot tap, ever so slightly, but tapping. They were there, somewhere, inside the horror. I sang in the ward for the men who'd lost their faces and were waiting for the reconstructive surgery they prayed would make them look human again. I studied autism and I studied retardation. I learned that nature can make cruel mistakes, and the mistakes, however frightening, will live and talk and want attention and need love. I had to learn that madness and error are in us all, and it's only by a hair's breadth that we are who we are. Thank you.